quest to succeed. Chapter 39. Jay had a wide variety of interests. He was sometimes requested to talk to young people on these themes. They wanted to know the distinction between an individual and society and who was more important. Where and in what situations could an individual make progress and prosper? For Jay, individual freedom was paramount. A controlled human being could not thrive or make advancements in his/her life. They would not be able to contribute a great deal to the community, as they would like to do. An individual could not make progress under restrictions. He was also aware that a framework of rules was needed to endure a civilized life. Man was a social being. Other people were required to communicate with, to live, and to work together. Eastern and Western philosophers have maintained that unity was required between individuality and society. Both were vital for survival and upward mobility. Certain facilities were needed by a person, which could be provided only in a society or by specialized groups. The Hindu Upanishads had also argued for a unity between individual freedom and the community. It had been suggested that he who sees the one in the spirit of all could look with contempt at no creature. Jay maintained that the interests of an individual and the community were not contradictory, because people tend to identify themselves with each other. People saw themselves as members of the community where they lived. In the 21st century, people had observed that development of an individual self was possible only in a free environment. Of course, some people attempt to create obstacles in other people's progress. It could, however, be caused by jealousy, contempt, or any other psychological or social factor. Groups or individuals might attempt to control their fellow citizens and residents in the vicinity. Communality and individuality, nevertheless, were reinforcing. It was only by developing his own individuality that a person could contribute to amplifying other people's personalities. It was in society that a man could find possibilities of manifestation and forward movement. Jay suggested that an individual should be able to take his own decision without any restrictions and hindrances from any outside pressures. Society could unfold an exchange of ideas, make suggestions to facilitate and promote advancement. The final decision should, however, be left to an individual. It would be in his or her interest and for his or her welfare. It was only by conforming to his own will that a person could feel free. They should not give up their own moral principles and values. No individual could flourish without the breakthrough of the nation. Temporarily, the achievement of individuals might look brighter, and that should be good enough for others to follow. In this process, education could play an imperative role and could lead to efficiency and save time and resources. He sustained that self-consciousness enriches personality and strengthens the self of an individual. Without the individual's development, the elevation of society would not be possible. With liberty, however, there was a need for equality of opportunity to share the same social environment. If people were unequal socially and economically, they would be disruptive in the overall headway of the nation. Members of society might display superiority complex and attempt to control others. Outside the society, however, development of individuality and of the self could be obstructed. When people work for the welfare of all, they also work for their own welfare. In a communal society, people defend the interests of each other. There was no clash of interest between an individual and the society. The self-evolution by an individual was consistent with the society's advancement. When a person makes progress, others also tend to elevate themselves because they are part of the nation. Individuals and society are therefore interdependent and indivisible. Their interests are identical, supportive, and reinforcing. There was, however, a need for mutual understanding and cooperation between the communities. There should be no richness and no poverty, no superior or inferior in a society. It has been argued that society helps individuals to realize their moral and economic existence. There should be nothing abstract. All tend to play a positive role. It was therefore imperative to provide an apparatus, a system to regulate the society for the sake of defending an individual's interests and freedoms. It was important to stop any conflict. Change was the law of nature. Society and individuals should adjust with the changing circumstances. Still, it would require simplicity, freedom, equality, and social justice in contemplation of individuals and society for a contented living and prosperity. Jay was often asked to talk to scholarly groups to share his knowledge and experience with them. The International Institute of Comparative Studies in Somerset, southwest England, invited him to speak on economic relations between the North, advanced countries, and the South, developing countries. They thought that Jay might have knowledge of both. He was born in a developing country and had lived most of his life in an advanced nation. He spoke for about 25 minutes to half an hour. He was then open to discussion. He started by saying that the world was one and he believed in cooperation between nations. Indeed, he expected both the North and the South to work in partnership with each other. He said that the developed countries had capital and technology. There could be capital investment and transfer of technology from the rich countries to the developing countries to increase the use of their resources for the advantage of their compatriots and indeed the world. Every nation would gain by the expedient use of their assets, which will benefit the whole humankind. Jay was aware that the capitalist advanced countries had skilled workforce and managerial talents. The southern countries were waiting to develop expertise, knowledge, and education, which could be provided by the rich advanced nations. They could open colleges and institutions of technology in the developing regions. They could also provide scholarships to students to study at their universities. As a matter of fact, the North-South divide was the consequence of imperialism and colonialism and exploitation of the natural and human resources by the European countries in the 18th and the 19th centuries. It led to stagnation of economies in the colonies. India, an industrialized nation until the 18th century, was turned into an agricultural country by the British. His study had shown that the British Industrial Revolution grew out of the decline and ashes of the Indian cotton industry in the 19th century. While the Indian cotton goods production and exports declined, the British cotton industry grew and prospered. Its exports rose. On many occasions, the British cotton goods were given preference in taxation in place of the local cotton goods in India. Import subsidies were provided for the British goods sold in the colonies and the empire. Heavy duties were imposed on home-produced goods in these countries. Jay expressed the view that it was essential for the advanced nations to invest capital in human resources in the developing countries in order to help them in achieving economic growth. Both private and public sectors could play a significant role in developing the manufacturing sector in the southern countries. This investment would trigger expansion that would lead to further growth and employment. The purchasing power of local people would increase, which would spur further job creation. Invention and innovation could assist the southern countries. Foreign investment could be tricky. The advanced countries invest in areas which benefit them. Consumers, goods industries, assembling of smart mobile phones and smart televisions and washing machines had attracted financing in the advancing nations from the rich countries. The manufacturing of these goods would still provide employment to local youth and other workforce. Domestic savings and investment could lead to development. The economies would accelerate in the countries of the South. The problem was that these countries had little savings to invest in the manufacturing sector. They do not have a large entrepreneurial class to set up their own businesses. They could, however, produce agricultural goods and start food processing industries, along with some manufactured goods industries. Trade could also be developed between the nations of the South themselves. They could specialize in their fields of expertise. South-South trade would benefit the developing countries. It could be for their mutual benefit because these countries were at the same level of technology usage. There had also been an argument whether the developed countries should provide aid or develop trade with the less developed nations. In Jay's opinion, this had been a dilemma since the end of the Second World War, when most of the colonies were freed. All the rich countries, however, did not provide the aid of 0.7% of their GDP. which was suggested by the United Nations. It was therefore essential to develop trade between the nations. International trade should take place without tariffs or with low tariffs. He told his audience that the rich developed countries should realize that they could not dictate the terms of trade to other nations. In the past, everything worked for the interest of the European states. The developing countries had realized that they would have to stand up for their people's rights and their economic welfare. He argued that the rich countries had often used the environment and social concerns as a means for protectionism. They had proclaimed against industrialization in the developing countries. The labor laws and pollution created by factories were the main reasons against industrial development in the South. Although it was the European countries and the United States of America which created most pollution and disfigured the world environment, the southern countries nevertheless started to develop industries by the end of the 20th century. They manufactured goods as their import substitutes and later started to export their products. Self-help was considered vital. They also recognized their own interests and knew what was economically advantageous for them. Jay argued in favor of the developing nations. Industrialization was the only route to achieving economic growth, for providing employment to their people and take away some burden from agriculture. Far too many people worked on farms in these countries. The agricultural yield was not sufficient, and in accordance with the resources put into this sector, it was sometimes less than half of the output provided by the United States of America. Jay examined the problems confronted by the developing countries. Many of them could not pay their loans borrowed from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank or the regional development banks. The economic productivity was low. The workforce was inefficient. The politicians were corrupt. To set up a factory or another business, the investor had to bribe the local politicians and administrators. Without prior payment of what was called a commission, the files would not move forward for decision-making by the relevant officials. Surprisingly, the commission demanded by the decision-makers in these countries was to be deposited in Western banks. This did not help with investment or creating employment. The money was not even transacted, yet it was considered as a loan to the nation. This part of the loan never entered the country. Jay was disgusted with this kind of practice and conduct by the decision-makers. He considered it utterly disgraceful. In course of time, some politicians and administrators were caught, especially in India, but the money could not be chased. These politicians and administrators did not realize that an investment was coming into their country, which would create employment for their people and their constituents. They thought that the investors wanted to start business in their countries to make profit. They therefore wanted their share of that gain in advance. Some Western investors, indeed, returned home without even discussing the projects or the level of investment. Jay felt that depositing the bribe money in Western banks was a transfer of resources from the developing countries to rich countries rather than the other way round. The interest and profits were being paid on loans, which never came to the nation. The transfer of profits to the investing country was also a withdrawal from the developing countries. If these profits could be plowed back into the economy of a nation, it would have led to growth, employment, and further expansion. It was being denied by the selfishness and greed of some politicians and civil servants. Nevertheless, cooperation between the rich and the developing countries had been profitable in the 21st century. India has developed its computer software industry to meet the demand of the United States, Britain, Japan, and the European countries. The advanced rich countries were genuinely interested in helping the less developed nations. Jay established that economic growth could be achieved through exports. If the rich countries wanted to assist the underdeveloped nations, they should purchase products from the latter. They had, however, criticized the goods manufactured in these nations as the products of cheap workforce or sweat labor. Still, these cheap goods have penetrated the markets of rich nations through the dollar shops or the pound plus stores. He discovered that in the 20th century, there was hardly any progress in transfer of technology or investment from the advanced rich nations to the developing countries. If there was any transfer of technology, the old redundant technology, which had become unworkable in the rich states, was being disposed of to them. No modern technology was passed on to the poor nations. These nations were despised and neglected. Some countries were, however, making efforts through education, which was to become a vehicle for economic and social progress. In course of time, the advanced developing nations decided to increase trade and investment among themselves. It became feasible after the fall of the Soviet Union, when all the states of that union became independent.